Weisbach, and I see a few familiar faces here. So what I'd like to talk about is, I guess I have to give a talk once on sort of what's sort of a hot topic, and why are things hot, and how do we think about research topics. And I'll talk about that for a little bit, and then I'll talk about the journal process, because I used to be an editor of RFS, and so I handled a lot of papers over 7 years, and so I just thought I'd walk you through a little bit about how it works, and how do you submit a paper, what happens in the other end when you're sort of waiting for to hear back from the journal. So anyway, so how do we think about picking research topics, and how does the journal process, and also how do you deal with the process, right? I mean, as these guys sort of described, a lot of your success or failure in your career as a professor, it depends on whether you can publish your work and how you best deal with the process. Learning how to deal with the process is actually quite important. So, okay, so what's our research about? I think to take a step back and think about, well, why do we write papers? What motivates our papers? And why do we do it? Okay, and one of the misleading things students sometimes, impressions you get when you take classes, is you start off with the fundamental papers. So you start off with Black and Scholes and Merton Miller and all the classic Grossman-Hart papers. And these are sort of fundamental papers that ask fundamental questions about what we do. Okay? And I would think that, I will tell you that if you're capable of writing papers like that, go do it, okay? But most of us aren't. And so most of us are actually much more motivated by more applied topics, and is really motivated by what's going on in the world. Okay? So that, and so I think one thing Jeff and I have been in this business for a while. I was thinking back to when we met. I have gray hairs. We got there yet, but we're started about the same time in the 80s. And so one of the things I've observed is that what's hot is really a function of what's happening in the real world out there. And I'll say most of what I will say is about corporate finance, because that's what I focus on. But I would think it applies to other fields as well. So here's a biased view. Biased just because it says based on what I think is important, of what has been hot in corporate finance since I entered graduate school way back in 1983. And I hope most of you were born then, but some of you probably weren't. And sorry, I violated Lolita's rule of having too small a font on that. In the mid-1980s, takeover research was very hot. So there was a classic Grossman-Hart paper in the early 80s, and then Schleifer-Vishny had their early work that was very, very, very good. And about takeovers, and there was a big JFE conference. So takeovers were really hot in the mid-80s. Okay. By the late 1980s, governance and its relation to takeovers, and that's where my dissertation started. Then internal capital markets and diversification was very, very big. And there was a huge literature, which you guys don't read anymore, about why the Japanese kairetsu market was really, really wonderful, and why the Japanese were going to take over the world because they have a kairetsu system. And by the early 90s, there was actually a big debate on bankruptcy. In the US, there was a debate on Chapter 11 versus immediate liquidation. Internationally, well, there was a big debate on how to structure bankruptcy systems in the former communist countries. Financial development became big, and then all of a sudden the Japanese kairetsu system became bad, and there were lots of papers, written sometimes by the same people that wrote those papers, about why the Japanese kairetsu system was a disaster. Okay. Well, what was going on in this column here? Think about what was going on in the world, the real world, not the professor world, at the same time. So there was a huge takeover boom in the 1980s, okay, which sparked a lot of literature there. There was, it turned out, I think the general consensus at the time was that most of the takeovers, at least in the 80s, were motivated by mismanagement. And so therefore, mismanagement, mismanagement is, well, if there's mismanagement, well, then we should study corporate governance, right? Many of the takeovers were, in fact, bust-up takeovers, where they would take a conglomerate that did lots of different things and bust them up and create value. And so therefore, well, why is therefore internal capital markets must be bad, right? And then, of course, there was a Japanese stock market that was booming like mad. In the 90s, there was a recession in the early 90s. Probably most of you don't remember that, but there was. And a lot of the LBOs had lots of debt they put on in the 1980s, and they went bankrupt in the early 90s. Internationally, the Cold War ended, and many countries, in Eastern Europe especially, were starting from scratch. And by the way, you can have these slides, you can interrupt with questions, so don't have to come here. Yeah. Many of the countries were starting from scratch, and so they were designing bankruptcy systems, and so the literature, the academic literature, was again motivated by what was going on in the world. And then, of course, the Japanese stock market crashed in the early 90s. So, what happened later in the academic world? The mid to late 90s, there was a big literature on entrepreneurial finance, venture capital. IPOs, Jay Ritter was just here, and most of his famous work was on IPOs, and this was a lot of it was in the 90s. Behavioral finance started being big, and then law and finance took off in the late 90s. After 2000, corporate governance became a more hot topic. As Lilith said, executive compensation, private equity, international corporate finance, and how you could raise capital internationally. And in recent years, anything to do with the financial crisis. And, so that's kind of been what I think has been hot in corporate, or what's going on in the world after this time. There's an internet bubble in the late 90s, which created a literature on entrepreneurial finance and venture capital. There were a lot of IPOs in the world, and so therefore there were a lot of papers about IPOs. The stock market really appeared to be overvalued to a lot of us in the late 90s. It turned out that I think most people think we were right at the time. And then there was a big question internationally about how to improve development. And so the law and finance literature came out of real questions about how to improve development. And after 2000, well, there was Enron and WorldCom. There were big scandals, and that led to the literature on corporate governance. There was an LBO boom, which created literature on private equity. Financial markets became much more global, and so the corporate literature became interested in that. And then finally, there was a financial crisis. So what's next? It's really hard to know, right? But I wish I did. But I think there are, as you're thinking about your research, I think there's fundamental things that are changing in the world, and that's going to change the way corporations finance their investments. And I think that's the sort of thing you want to think about when forming your research career. Oh, what did I do? Okay. So I think a sensible research strategy would be to understand the implications of these underlying shifts. And so that's kind of not a bad thing to do. So I'll give a few examples now of some things I think are going on in the world and how it's affected some of my research and some other research that I like. So one of the things that's going on is the debt structure has changed. The capital structures have become much more complicated. And so, one of the things that we've observed is that you can now package debt and sell it. And how does that affect its usage? Well, how does that affect, not only does it affect its usage, how does it affect the optimal capital structure? And what's the new ownership structure of the debt? And how does this change matter, right? And another question is, how does the fact that debt is sold off the fact that debt can be sold affect the reorganizations in bankruptcy? And these are the kinds of questions. Another question that has been asked, I forgot to put up there, is how does the fact that the debt can be sold affect the monitoring role of the debt holders, right? That's another, there's been some nice papers on that theme. And finally, what do actual capital structures look like? And one of the myths of our classes is, we teach corporate finance, you start with debt and your equity. No firm actually just has debt and equity. They have a million different kinds of debt and lots of different kinds of equity. And a nice paper by Rao and Sufi that we published when I was editor of RFS is this, and then one of my papers does a similar analysis of the capital structure of LBO firms. Globalization. Okay, how does the increasingly global nature of financial markets affect the capital raising process? And do multinationals have an advantage to be able to access capital markets in different countries? We had a dissertation at OSU a few years ago by Yijin Zhang, who's now a professor at Purdue, that looks at that question. What's the optimal ownership structure across countries? I mean, what's the optimal pattern of cross-border M&A, and I have a paper about who buys whom. At the end of the day, who should own the company's assets, given that there's a global market for assets? Should they be owned by people in the home country, or people in the US, or people in China? I don't know. I mean, it seems like these are all kinds of very interesting questions that really come out of the globalization that's going on in the world that really haven't really been answered. And how does a global economy affect domestic and regulatory legal structure? So these are the kinds of things that, to me, would be good things to work on. Another thing is that there's the development of capital market through engineering and innovation. How does innovation in the form of new securities or the fact that old securities are more liquid than they used to be affect their uses by firms? I don't know. How does one design an optimal capital structure with lots of different kinds of securities? I mean, that's certainly the kind of question that I think financial managers actually face. But again, we got theorists over here. Maybe they're talking about that. In other words, what's the role of new securities in liquidity management? I have this survey paper on liquidity management with some of my Brazilian co-authors that we published a year ago. And finally, alternative assets is a new interest of mine. It seems that if you look at the nature of the assets in the economy, that there's been a big trend towards these alternative assets, private equity and hedge funds. What's their performance been? There's been a huge literature, a small literature on this, because it's actually much kind of difficult to measure performance and look at them. And what's the long run outlook for these assets? Every time I hear about LBOs, I sort of think that, well, there's only so many companies that can be bought, right? And so therefore, eventually they'll all be bought, and then there won't be need for any more LBOs. But somehow that doesn't seem to work in practice. And how does the maturing of the alternative asset markets affect their performance, right? It used to be that LBOs were this kind of new thing that nobody knew about, and now we all teach classes in LBOs. And so how does it affect the fact that there's not a scarce resource anymore? And finally, this is a new paper that hasn't been circulated yet, but will be in a month or two. And what's the cost of transacting these alternative assets from one investor to another, and how why does that affect the market and how it's set up? And so that's kind of so again, the general theme, I think, is that much really interesting research is motivated, not by kind of thinking deep thoughts at the bar, but really looking at what happens in the world and trying to understand and explain it in sort of economic terms. Okay, so that's kind of the first part of my talk. The second part is the journal submission process. So I'm often asked about the process used at RFS. I was an editor of RFS from 2006 to 2013. So I did it for 7.5 years. The way RFS works is there's one executive editor, and then there's a whole team of regular editors. And I was one of the regular editors. So Matt Spiegel was the executive editor when I started, and David Hirschleifer took over a couple of years, I forget what year he took over. And then he stepped down recently, and Andrew Caroli is now the executive editor. So Andrew was a regular editor when I was an editor, and now, so anyway, so that's kind of the way it works. So basically, the quick summary, and I'm pretty sure it hasn't changed since I stepped down in 2013. You submit a paper, okay? So you send it in through the online system. There's a nice woman named Jacqueline who actually is a real person, even though you think of her as just a computer thing. And she looks it over, and they have a rule to make sure the font is okay, because there's one author who will remain nameless who used to send in 60-page papers in this tiny little font. And so now they have a minimum font size because of him. And then what they do, which is true, and then there was, one of the things that RFS does that's really good is there's a postdoc. And I don't know who it is anymore, or maybe it will be one of you. But basically the postdoc is in charge of going through the paper first and then suggesting referees to you as the editor. Occasionally the postdoc will suggest a desk reject. Usually that happens when there's like a practitioner who sends in a paper that's really not of interest to academics. And the postdoc, my experience was they did a really good job of suggesting referees. Now, usually what happened was sometimes they'll suggest the people that you would have thought of otherwise, but sometimes they'll suggest people who you kind of met a couple years ago, but you don't really know, and you forgot that he worked in this area, but he'll actually be perfect for the paper. And so that happened a fair amount of time. But then the way they do it is so that then Andrew, or whoever the executive editor is, will assign it to you as the regular editor. And then you sort of have total control of the paper. So you can accept or reject. And David put in a system where he wanted to approve any paper that you were going to give a revision request, but he always did, and put in his 2 cents about how to do. Okay. The executive editor in general takes more papers than the other editors, and he tends to take the hard ones or the ones that are in between areas that nobody can handle. And what's nice for me was there's so many people working in corporate finance that almost all of the papers I handled were in corporate finance, which is sort of very nice because it's nice when you handle papers that are in your area that you can read yourself and give comments on. Not that I couldn't read a paper on macro finance and give good comments on, but it wouldn't be as useful as if it was in my area. Yeah.
So maybe related to the postdoc, a potentially useful experience or idiosyncratic experience I had is that they seem to run an algorithm on sort of with a human brain on who you cite in your introduction, potentially. So to the extent that people are worried about writing and positioning their paper, at least the better experiences I had seemed to referees coming from where the contribution was strong as opposed to, I don't know how the postdoc really works, but
I don't know. I mean, literally,
times.
I'm not sure I've ever met one of the postdocs in person. I emailed with them a little bit. When I was editor, you would get the paper about a week after. You would get an email, and then you'd click, and then you'd see the screen, and then we'd see like 3 or 4 referees, and then you would pick the referees. Right?
But this person reads the paper somehow or screen?
Yeah, he would read the paper, and he would look at the papers that were referenced, and he'd look at the papers in the area and think about it.
Do you have a sense what the instructions from Andrew are in the postdoc?
Well, just to suggest referees.
I mean, just specific. Any other guidance? I mean, this may be more of a...
I don't know. I literally don't know what... I mean, I wasn't even doing it when Andrew did it, but I think when Matt and David were doing it, they told him to suggest... I mean, occasionally they would, well, Gene Farmer would be good at this paper. You don't ask people if Gene Farmer to referee papers. I never read it. Yeah, Bill Schwartz does, but yeah.
I think it's important for people here to understand that not all journals follow this process.
Yeah, no, I would say this is the RFS-specific process.
Journal of Finance is the associate editors of big referees.
Yeah.
And they also do the desktop rejections.
Yes. So yes, that's a good point. This is the way the RFS did it. The JF, I always found the JF much more bureaucratic, where they only have 3 editors, and they used to only have 1 editor. So that you have to handle a lot. They handle a lot more papers per editor, and they rely more on the associate editors, who would then pick the referees, and they do the desk rejections as well. Yeah. Okay.
Or they recommend this.
Yeah.
It's the editors, the co-editors who actually decide at the end of the day. Because those editors are just...
So is it your perception that, when I'm assigning referees, I will look at the paper, and as Dirk suggests, I'll look at the introduction, but sometimes the introduction isn't well enough formed to do this, but look at the introduction and try to understand precisely where the contribution actually might lie, and sometimes that's indicated by who the authors, if they're alert, are framing that, right? They're framing their paper in the introduction with those things. So it's for sure for me, it's correlated with who resides in the introduction. I don't know, Peter, if that's your experience or not in assigning referees.
I did look through the entire paper.
Yeah.
Wow. John, and that's your question.
I think I'm not positive, but I think the doctoral student was told to look for papers that should have been cited that weren't cited. Also.
Oh, really? Yeah, that actually is often. I will pick a referee from the uncited papers in case that happens. Absolutely.
All right, so maybe I should move on. And so, okay, so what the paper's been assigned to me. What do I do? Okay, I read the paper maybe about half the time I use the referees. I use the referees suggested by the postdoc. I would often I would think they're perfectly fine suggestions, but I have somebody I'd like to use. I have a colleague or I have somebody I know who I think would be I mean, in general, I thought the postdoc generally did a really surprisingly good job, and they often think of the perfect person who was somebody who I personally wouldn't have thought of. One of the things that I did, and again, it's just me, but I think probably other editors, I tended to use people I knew personally than by reputation, and for several reasons. First of all, they're more likely to do the report, right? I mean, if I see Lolita here, she would be more likely. I'm not doing this anymore, but she'd be more likely to do a report than if I just asked, came from a total stranger. The other thing is you kind of want to know who the referee is and what they're like, and you know the way people are, right? So some people are just sort of tend to be negative about everything, right? So if a person like that gives even a slightly positive report, then you have to sort of jump on it and say this is good. Whereas there's some people who are just really a little over enthusiastic, and so you kind of need to temper it down a little bit. And finally, I tend to trust more people I know more than I don't. Anyway, that's the way I did it. And the other question I always got at the RFS is how do we decide on the number of referees? And so, first of all, the JFE tends to use 1, the JF tends to use 2. Is that a hard and fast rule, or is it? The rule I had at RFS was I used 1 referee unless I had a reason to use more than 1, but there were often reasons. So what were the reasons? Sometimes there's a conflict, right? So sometimes you have a paper that's very critical of somebody else's paper. So the way I like to handle papers like that is I would want to know what the guy who's being criticized really thinks of the paper, because often they like know there's a major flaw with the criticism. But I also want a neutral observer who just to basically kind of guide me on who's right. So in that case, I would probably use 2 reports. Sometimes the best person is a very senior person who's unlikely to give a detailed report, in which case I might ask a junior person to go to the paper more carefully. Sometimes I know a grad student or a young faculty member working in the area, and I would ask them to write a second report on the paper. Sometimes there were multiple issues with the paper, so that there's a model that's kind of complicated, and there's empirical work, and so I might want to ask a theorist and an empiricist. Anyway, so these are, and finally, sometimes the initial report is late, and so when that happens, David used to send me emails, Mike, you really should send it to a second referee, and I'm like, no, I like the person, I think he can do a great report, it's just taking him 6 months, but he'll eventually do it, and David said, Mike, I'll give you 2 more weeks, and then you better send it to another referee, and eventually we would do it. And so sometimes the referee reports aren't very well done, and sometimes they're ambiguous, they don't know what to say, right? So they'll say, I don't really know what advice to give you on the paper, and so, okay, I'll send it to another referee. One thing I'll say is referees, is interesting, because when you're the author, I will tell you, if you go to the cocktail party and you listen to the professors talk to one another, I guarantee you will hear them complaining about referees. That's one thing we do when we get together, we just complain about referees. Referees are totally unfair, biased, you name it. When you're actually the editor, you're surprised by the other fact that you're actually shocked that they do such a good job. They are thorough, most of them are on time. They spend, for astonishingly little money, they'll write 4 or 5 very detailed, constructive comments that are often ignored completely by the authors, who then complain about them at the cocktail parties at the FMA meeting. So, I mean, there's 2 sides to this, right? And most referees do a really, really good job. And I just want to say that because you'll hear and the other thing you'll hear me complain about too. It's not like I'm guilty, right? So when I get referees on my own papers, I complain about it too. So this is one of the things we do, right? So okay, what do you do when you get the report back from the referee? Well, you read the letter, you read the report, and if the referee just hates the paper, you reject it pretty quickly. If the referee's on the fence, then I try to read it carefully. Sometimes I get a second opinion. Sometimes I go down the hall and ask my colleagues what they think. And if the referee likes the paper, and it seems like the paper's potential publication, I'll read it myself. So, I'll read it more carefully myself. So, sometimes I disagreed with the referee and rejected the paper anyway. Sometimes I sent it to a second referee. Sometimes, if I didn't think I would look at the referee's reasons for rejecting the paper, and if I didn't think the reasons made sense, I would read it carefully myself, and sometimes I overruled them. Again, the referee is just advisory to the editor, and you basically get to make calls on what happened. And it's a good system because the referees have biases in their own. One of the things that I did, well, and I don't think this is true of all editors. I tended not to ask for revision if I don't think the paper didn't think the paper had a really good shot of getting in. So it was very, very, very rare that I would ask for a paper for revision and it didn't ultimately get published. Now, that being said, I would issue stern warnings in the editor's letter that, you know, if you do this, it's a very high likelihood that your paper would get published, but what the equilibrium tended to be that scared the authors into doing the right thing, and the papers eventually did get published. That's the way it worked for me. Again, this is all, when I'm an author, I just can't stand it when you work and you do a revision 2 or 3 times, and then eventually your paper gets rejected. That's just the most painful thing in the world. So when I was the editor, I tended not to try to avoid that as much as I can. So I tended to not do like the reject and resubmit, where if you totally rewrite your paper, we would be willing to. I tended just to reject it, but what's that? Yeah. So anyway, that's just the way I did it. There was an appeal process at RFS that works really well, I think. And Bill Short has one at the JFE, and I'm pretty sure they have one at the JF as well. Matt Spiegel started it, and the thing that you should realize is rejections do get overturned, okay? And there's no stigma to appealing your rejection if you have a good reason, right? The way it worked was I would call somebody up, so I might call Dirk up and say, look, Dirk, I want you to handle the appeal. And typically what I would do is I would basically delegate the decision rights on the appeal to Dirk. And I would say, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go and tell me who a new referee would be. And I would give him all the information, all the referee reports, all the correspondence. The authors would write a letter complaining about it, and he would get all of that. And then I would say, okay, just tell me who to send the paper to as a new referee, if you think there should be a new referee, which they almost always did. He would have the right of saying, no, the authors are crazy, just reject the paper. I can't ever think of that happening. And then he would pick a new referee and tell me, and then I would send the request to the referee. The idea is you don't want the referee to know that it's been a paper that's been appealed. You want them to just think of it as a new submission. And then as soon as I get it back from the referee, I would send it to him. And then he would generally write his own report as well and tell me what to do. And then I can't ever think of an advice where I didn't follow the advice of the omnibus referee or whatever it is. So that's the omnibus. He would be called that's a Matt Spiegel term. It's the omnibus referee. I'm not sure where he came up with it, which is the one who makes a decision and tells me what to tell the author. And so the idea is that you can remain anonymous that way, and I would basically take the blame and I would be the person the author would get mad at if it was a rejection. So okay, so that's the way the process works. And then ultimately, most papers go through several rounds before they are accepted. But again, I didn't like to start the process of reviewing papers unless I thought it was really going to make it through. And so, okay, so what can you do to improve your chances? Okay, well, take the process seriously. Okay, no one can write 10 good papers a year, not even Gene Fama. So don't submit tons of papers to the top journals. It just signals you don't take the process seriously. There's nothing that annoys editors more than if they think that, I guess it's called the shotgun style of research, where shotgun has all these little pellets, and you don't much care which one of them hits the deer, just so long as one of them hits the deer. If the people that write lots of papers, not caring which one of them hits the journals, so long as one of them hits the journals, that just annoys the editors to no end, because it's a serious process where we do this for a living, and if you think a paper is a serious contribution, then you should submit it. If you don't, then you shouldn't submit it. But that's not something that is good. Proofread your paper carefully, okay? I will go further than a little week. I think there should be no typos, misspellings on a submitted paper. By the time you submit a paper, you should get every friend of yours, your spouse, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, whatever, to read it as many times as you possibly can before completely driving them crazy. and to fix all the typos. It's just you're a professional, right? You're applying for jobs. You're doing this for a living, right? It's not some hobby you have. You know, your paper is your masterpiece. The last thing you should have are typos in it, okay? And the other thing is consider sending your paper to a professional editor before submitting, okay? Again, you're supposed to be a professional. It's not the editor's or the referee's job to fix your writing, okay? The badly written papers are the easiest papers to referee. I mean, if you get a paper that's badly written as a referee, it's not your job to figure out what the author really meant. You just reject it. I mean, you know, you do not have to rewrite papers. And so I know a lot of you are from another country, China. If you're from China or Korea, I mean, it is true. I can tell you that every one of your papers is 1,000 times better than any paper I could write in Chinese or Korean, right? That's completely irrelevant. It's harder if English is not your first language, right? But that doesn't change the fact that, you know, the journals are in English, and you're competing. It's a competitive market. You're competing for journal space, and it matters how good your English is, and so therefore you have to really work at it. Shorten your paper. Okay. One of the things that is true is it's just easier to publish a paper that's 30 pages of text, except yes.
So for the copy editor, do the journals suggest names, Mike?
Not that I
That might be
know of.
helpful if, or maybe they don't know.
Yeah, the journals don't typically do it.
Yeah, but they can suggest some people, so authors know that.
Yeah, I don't actually use a copy editor myself, but
Yeah, but
I don't have any names to know. I think it would be good to have on the JF, one of the big websites, have names of reputable copy editors. But
Many universities have
Yeah.
something like that, so locally you can get. It's a universal problem.
And when I say that, shorten your paper, I don't mean that. I mean the best paper, of course, is a paper that has lots of substance, and so therefore it has to be a certain length. But typically, most papers, especially sort of applied empirical ones, you know, can be shortened substantially, especially job market papers. One of the cardinal sins of job market papers is they tend to be really long, and by the time you go through the market and submit your paper in June, it'll be 45, 50 pages with 15 tables, and no referee would ever want to go through this. So the first thing you have to do is to chop it way down and get rid of all the extra stuff and really get it down to the main point. And the other thing is you have to make your contribution clear to a non-specialist. Okay, so that, you know, if you want to be, the top journals are really, you know, general interest finance journals, and, you know, it would be really nice if you could get to a general interest economics journal, because finance is a subfield of the field of economics. So what you have to do is you have to explain why your paper is interesting, important, not just to a specialist in your little field, right? If you come up with a new way to price European options that's only interested in people who are interested in European options and not a general interest to the profession, then probably a general interest journal is not going to be interested. But if you explain why it's important that this everyone know about this new technique, then that is the kind of thing that would be. And you need to explain this to the referee, to the editor. And remember, the editor, most papers that are submitted are correct, okay? In other words, you know, you shouldn't, a lot of people complain, well, my paper was right, I proved the theorem, or my regressions are well specified. Most, you know, there's an 8% acceptance rate, or 6%, something like that, on the top journals. And out of 100 papers that are submitted, maybe 90 of them will be correct. I mean, a few of them will have mistakes, but fewer will have mistakes than there used to be. But what the real judgment is over whether the contribution is large enough to justify publication. And so, now the other thing, one of my pet peeves, I'll stop after this, is that the introduction to your paper is like the most important part of your paper. So I always use, when I talk to students, I always use the analogy of the land in a city, right? So if you think about, you know, the land in a city, if you go to New York, our biggest city, right, the most expensive property where all the movie stars live is the overlooking Central Park, right? That's the condos go for $1 million. And then there's property way outside by the airport in the empty lots, which is dirt cheap, right? If you think about your paper the same way, The most expensive property in your paper is the introduction. That's the thing that most people will read, right? When you go to a seminar, right? Think about your average Friday when you go to your departmental seminar. You say, oh my God, there's a seminar, I haven't read the paper, let me look at it quickly, right? So you read the first 2 or 3 pages. If you get a copy of the JF, you know, in the mail, if you're like me, you'll scan through every article, you try to. But you won't be able to go through every proof of every theorem, but you will be able to look through these. So the most valuable space you have is in the introduction. So what you want to do is you want to make your contribution, as well as the way you overcome the main hurdles, you know, such as the identification or data issues or something, crystal clear and a well-written, concise introduction. And to details beyond what is interesting to a typical reader, we'll typically go into an appendix or somewhere later on in the paper, right? So you have to think about different kinds of readers for your papers. So the introduction is for everybody, and then, like, if you are doing a dissertation on payday loans, right? So then you have to then if you'll look up all the payday loans papers and you'll read everything very carefully about payday loans, and you'll go through the appendices of all the papers. But, you know, because it's on your topic. But, you know, with the introduction is for a general reader. And so you know, one of that's, I always end up rewriting lots of students' introductions because they tend not to, it's a hard thing to do. Another thing that I think Khalifa mentioned is you don't want to waste space. A standard mistake that students make is they feel like they have to be thorough and they have to do a thorough literature review. And often what they do is they will stick in a 3-page literature review in the introduction before they even explain what they do in their own paper. And as a result of that, no one ever gets to what they do in their own paper because they put their paper down. Right? So say what you do in your own paper, give all the people who do related work appropriate credit, but that should be after what you say, what you do in your paper, because people who pick up your paper want to know what you do, right? If you're interviewing with some schools, they want to know what you do. If you have a paper on about IPOs, they don't want to read about Jay Ritter's paper for 3 pages. They know Jay Ritter's paper, right? I mean, he's the president of the FMA. They want to know what your paper is about. And so say what your paper is about, and then when you get to page 6, then you can say how it relates to Jay's work. Now, one thing that you should realize is if your paper is rejected, okay, most probably, and this isn't always true, everyone sees conspiracies, the editor hates me, or this, that. Most probably what happened is the editor and referee really did give you a fair shot, and they did take the process seriously, and they did give you a fair shot at getting into the journal. So what you should do, if the paper is rejected, you should take the comments of the referee seriously, and address, as again was said earlier, and address them even if your paper is rejected. Nothing annoys referees more than spending a week writing long, detailed comments for one journal, and then if you're the obvious referee, then the paper gets rejected. Then who's the next journal going to send it to? Well, they send it to you, right? And so then you get the same paper with all of those comments that you spent a week of your time working on, and completely ignore. And this has happened. I'm sure this has happened to every single person sitting up there. And it's just totally infuriating when you're the referee because, first of all, it shows that the author doesn't care about, improving their paper. The author doesn't care about, the comments that you gave them. And what's the point of going through it again and writing the same comments down? Usually you simply say a quick note to the editor, time to reject this paper again. The author doesn't take it seriously. And not only will the editor reject that paper, but the editor will think the next paper you submit to him is probably a little bit below the bar. So anyway, so that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mike. Any questions for Professor Weisbach at this time? So yeah, please.
I have a question. So, do you have any guidance on which journal to submit to? I mean, it seems like there's C journals apart from Yosh going A journal, B journal, C journal.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think it depends on your paper, right? So, you generally want to try and get it into the best journal that you can get it into, right? But I mean, I'm of the view that there's some very good papers that are a little bit more specialized. And if you write a paper that's a little more specialized, a specialized paper about banking, maybe go appropriate for the Journal of Financial Intermediation. So you might try one of the top 3 journals, and if it doesn't get in, then know, you don't have to try all 3 of them if it's unlikely to get into those top journals, right? I mean, so every paper, I think, has an appropriate outlet. Obviously, we'd like all our papers to be in the JPE, right? I mean, that would just, we just would all love that, right? But you know, occasionally we write a paper we think has a shot at getting in one of the top econ journals, and then maybe we'll try it, right? But the other thing is to remember is the opportunity cost of submitting. The biggest opportunity, in my mind, the biggest opportunity cost of submitting to a journal and getting rejected is most of the time, right? Because, you know, I mean, just think about where you're going to be in 3 or 4 years, right? I think that in 3 or 4 years you'll have jobs, you'll be out there, and you want your dissertation published. Somebody said, sort of implied for the review process, but to me, the biggest cost of not having it published is it's still sitting there on your desk, taking up time taking up time and space in your brain, trying to figure out what to do with it and how to publish it. When 3 or 4 years ago, you're going to want to be sort of looking at what's going on in the world and thinking about the new papers that you're going to be writing. So I mean, I think that that some people err on the side of, you know, first of all, taking too long to get around to submitting a paper, and then also sort of insisting that you have to try journals that it's pretty clear it's not going to get into. So I mean, the three that are considered the top in finance are the Journal of Finance, the Journal of Financial Economic Review of Financial Studies, and people will argue endlessly over what the 4th one is. And I think the truth is there's a bunch of journals that are good, that are sort of roughly comparable, and so that's kind of how you do it. And I think one thing that you should also think about, this is sort of a little bit more out. If your department that hires you sort of values a particular journal maybe more than the rest of the profession does, it's okay to submit to that journal. There's nothing wrong with responding to incentives, right? I mean, like, some places count Management Science as one of the top journals, some places don't. You know, you should find out. If some places count JFQA as one of the top couple journals, some places don't. You should find out what your department, you know, how your department views these things. And you know, we write lots of papers about how people respond to incentives. There's nothing that says we can't respond to incentives ourselves, right? And so I don't think anything's wrong with that. But the other thing is you think about which editor, if there's an editor that is interested in your paper, right? So I mean, I think that you want to have an editor who understands what you're working on and has done similar work, does this all make sense, Jeff?